Today we are looking at a case from the late 19th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. Linn County is situated in the northern part of the state of Missouri, an area that in the late 19th century was made up of small farms, growing mainly corn and wheat. The United States had witnessed a dramatic expansion in farming since 1860, and by 1880, the number of farms across the country had more than doubled, as had the number of people employed to work on them. On the 11th of May 1894, a lady named Mrs. John Carter heard a knock at her door. It was strange, as it was still very early, and she had not been expecting a visitor. She was in her kitchen, but quickly made her way to the porch to see who the caller could be. To her surprise, it was Nellie Meeks, a 6-year-old girl who lived nearby. But Nellie did not look like she normally did. She was usually a nicely dressed child, as her mother made sure that all her children always looked their best. However, today, Nellie looked very different. Her dress was torn and dirty, and her face was covered with blood. She also had quite a deep scar on her forehead. Mrs. Carter asked the poor child what the matter was, but Nellie's speech was somewhat unclear. She eventually managed to say that she had slept in a straw stack next to the bodies of her parents and younger sisters, who had all been murdered. Mrs. Carter was taken aback. Linn County was a quiet place, somewhere safe to bring up a family. Surely this was not right, but Nellie looked like she had slept outside, and the gash on her head was deep. Mrs. Carter went to the room of her 9-year-old son named Jimmy and instructed him to go to the straw stack to see if the strange story that she had been told by young Nellie Meeks was true. While Jimmy was searching for the bodies, Mrs. Carter washed the blood from Nellie's face and gave her some food. The poor child was still speaking softly, and her words were hard to understand. Jimmy was not gone for long. He soon returned and informed his mother that there were indeed dead people in the straw stack. Mrs. Carter was shocked, as although it was clear that something had happened to the young girl, she did not think that the story of the bodies in the straw stack was going to be true. She thought that there would almost certainly be another explanation. As Nellie could not be left alone, Mrs. Carter told Jimmy to inform the neighbours, and he immediately ran off to find them. The first person he saw was a man named George Taylor, who was harrowing his cornfield. It was still very early, and it was strange that Mr. Taylor was working at this hour. It looked very much like he was trying to cover the wagon tracks that had been made the previous night. As Jimmy approached him, he told Mr. Taylor that there were dead people in the straw stack, so he must be careful when harrowing around it. What happened next was somewhat strange, as instead of George Taylor immediately going to investigate this terrible and distressing news, he instead took Jimmy to his house and told him to wait, as he first needed to unhitch his horses. Jimmy waited, but George Taylor never returned. He had actually saddled his horse and ridden to the nearby town of Browning, as he was anxious to speak to his brother, Mr. William Taylor. The Taylor brothers were well known in northeastern Missouri. They were wealthy and educated. William had graduated in law from the Missouri University and had served in the Missouri General Assembly. He now worked in Browning for the People's Exchange Bank. They both dressed in fine clothes and had been described as handsome and well-mannered. However, despite this, the perception of the two brothers by the people who lived in the towns of Milan and Browning had changed when in 1891 they were charged with forgery and larceny for issuing false bank drafts. They were also arrested for the crimes of arson and cattle rustling. Once George Taylor had located his brother, they quickly left town. A man named Mr. Tom Daly had seen Mr. George Taylor riding towards Browning, and not long afterwards he saw Mr. Taylor again, but this time he was accompanied by his brother Mr. William Taylor, and they were riding eastwards. It was now 8 o'clock in the morning, and Mr. Daly said that both men seemed to be in rather a hurry. Meanwhile, the authorities had been contacted, and at Mrs. Carter's house, 6-year-old Nellie Meeks was being looked after by the local doctor. When asked if she could explain what happened, she replied, "When we were going up the hill, the man without whiskers said his feet were cold and got out and walked alongside the wagon and shot Papa. Papa jumped out and started to run. Then Mama screamed and started to jump. They then hit me in the head and I went to sleep." When the man put me in the straw, the one with the whiskers kicked me on the back and said, "They're all dead now." They covered me up, and I could not breathe good. I heard them say it would not burn, as it would not catch. Word soon spread about the terrible murders of Mr. and Mrs. Meeks and 2 of their 3 daughters. Men from Milan and Browning set off in pursuit of the Taylors. As they did, an inquest was held to try and ascertain what had led to the tragic events that had happened the previous evening and who was responsible. The inquest was informed that Nellie's father, Mr. Gus Meeks, was a tenant farmer and that he had occupied land which was owned by George and William Taylor. Mr. Meeks had previously been arrested on the charge of cattle rustling, and when in court, he pleaded guilty. He was subsequently sent to prison. However, in the first week of April 1894, he was offered a pardon by the governor, a gentleman named Governor Stone, on condition that he testify in court against Mr. George and Mr. William Taylor. Wanting to return to his family, Mr. Meeks agreed. This, however, caused much concern to the Taylors. They knew that there were those in Linn County who would very much like to see them behind bars, and Gus Meeks agreed to give evidence against them was not something they could afford to happen. They would have to persuade him to change his mind. They went to his house and offered him $1,000, along with a wagon and horses, if he left the area. Gus Meeks agreed with their proposal. It was good for him, as he would have a wagon and horses and $1,000, and he thought that it would be easy for him to become a tenant farmer elsewhere, especially with such a large sum of money to assist him. The mother of Mr. Gus Meeks lived in the nearby town of Milan, but spent much time helping at her son's house. She told the inquest that Gus had kept her informed of the situation, and she knew of how he had agreed to testify against the Taylor brothers, but then instead decided to accept their offer of $1,000, horses and a wagon, to leave the county. She said that George and William Taylor had told her son that they would come to his house on the evening of Thursday the 10th of May. He would then leave with them, and when he had found a new tenant farm, he would send for his family to join him. However, this did not work out as George and William Taylor had planned, as when they arrived at the Meeks' small house, Mrs. Delora Meeks told them that her husband would not be leaving without her and the children. She did not trust the Taylors, and although she thought that they were capable of inflicting harm on her husband, she did not believe that they would ever try to hurt a woman or a child. Mrs. Delora Meeks was prepared. She had already put what little she owned into a few boxes, ready to start a new life somewhere else. However, no items that Mrs. Meeks would have packed were found. No bedding or clothing. It was also known that Mr. Meeks always wore a silver watch, which was not on his body when the family were taken to the mortuary. All the authorities had discovered in the straw stack was a partially burnt quilt. Nellie repeated at the inquest what she had already said when she had been examined by the doctor. From the evidence presented, a picture was emerging that under the cover of darkness, the Meeks family and the Taylors travelled west of Browning. When they reached the area near the schoolhouse, George Taylor got off the wagon and proceeded to shoot Mr. Meeks. He then shot his wife Delora and their baby. The 2 girls were hit with a piece of rock. The brothers then placed their bodies back on the wagon and took them to their farm some 2 miles away and placed them in the shallow graves beneath the straw stack, which had already been prepared. At the end of the hearing, the verdict of the coroner's jury found that the Meeks family had met their deaths by gunshot wounds and blows from a blunt object such as a rock, and the people who were responsible for this terrible crime were Mr. George Taylor and his brother, Mr. William Taylor. The brothers, however, had already left the county. 2 days later, on Sunday the 13th of May, a large crowd gathered to pay their respects as the bodies of Mr. Gus Meeks, his wife Delora, and their daughters Mammy and Hattie were buried at the Butte Cemetery in Sullivan County. The family were all placed in a single grave. Groups of men all carrying guns went in pursuit of the Taylors, and word was sent to all the surrounding counties to be on the lookout for the brothers. However, they managed to avoid arrest, and it was not until the 26th of June that they were eventually apprehended in the small town of Batesville in the state of Arkansas. They were taken back to Linn County, Missouri by train, but as local people had already decided that they were guilty, Mobs had been gathering to meet them, so instead they were taken off the train in Macon and transferred to the jail at Moberly. The Taylors' attorney asked that the Linn County Court set a bond of $50,000 for each of the brothers, but as following the crime, George and William Taylor had disappeared for over a month, the judge refused the request. The trial began on the 18th of March 1895 at the courthouse in the town of Carrollton in Carroll County, Missouri. George and William Taylor arrived to the courthouse wearing very smart suits and looking like two distinguished gentlemen. They seemed confident that they would be acquitted and denied that they had had anything to do with the murder of Mr. Gus Meeks, his wife Delora, and two of their daughters, Hattie and Mummy. Witnesses testified that they had previously heard the Taylors threaten Mr. Meeks. A lady named Mrs. Kitty Eddens told of how she had heard 5 gunshots shortly after midnight on Thursday the 11th of May. Mr. Meeks' mother also testified. She told the court that she had always found the Taylor brothers intimidating and feared that they may one day harm her son. She said that he had received a letter on the 10th of May that was written on the People's Exchange Bank headed paper. It was not signed, but instead had 3 stars. It simply read, "Be ready at 10. Everything is right." Witnesses had seen the brothers out in a wagon that evening, and one witness, named Mr. Dillinger, told the court that he had previously been told by William Taylor that he would kill Mr. Meeks. No one had actually seen either George or William Taylor commit the crime, and their defence attorney, a gentleman named Colonel John Hale, reiterated to the court that all the evidence presented was at best circumstantial, and there was no evidence which could convict the defendants. The defence brought many witnesses to the stand. Most of them were relatives of the Taylors. George Taylor's wife testified that her husband had been at home on the evening of May the 10th and never went out, and William Taylor's wife said that her husband had returned at 10 p.m. and then slept until 5 o'clock in the morning. There were questions about whether there was blood on the Taylors' wagon. Prosecution witnesses said that they had seen blood on the wagon, but witnesses for the defence said that the blood was old and there was also some red paint. Both George and William Taylor testified in their own defence, and their version of events that day were well rehearsed and almost identical. They told the same story as their wives had done, that they returned home and did not go out again. William said that George had come to see him on the morning of Friday the 11th of May and told him that Mr. Meeks had been killed and his body found on his farm. William said that George wanted to speak to the police and get them to investigate, but he did not think that that was a good idea, as he believed that they were being set up, as everyone knew that Gus Meeks had agreed to testify against them. When the trial ended, the jury deliberated for 2 days, but were unable to reach a verdict. They voted 7-5 in favour of a conviction. There would have to be a retrial. Before that happened, reports of bribery soon emerged, and one of the jurors told of how they had been offered $750 to vote for a not guilty verdict. The second trial began in July 1895, and the prosecution decided that instead of prosecuting the Taylor brothers with all 4 murders, they'd be tried only for the murder of Mr. Gus Meeks. The prosecution had concluded that it would be too difficult to prove that the murder of Mrs. Delora Meeks and the 2 girls was premeditated. During this time, Nellie Meeks was the ward of Mrs. Pierce, who was the wife of one of the prosecuting attorneys. Nellie did not testify at either trial, although the statement she made to the doctor when she was first being examined on the 11th of May 1894 was read out in court. During the proceedings, she would sometimes leave her chair and sit on the lap of Mrs. Pierce's husband, prosecuting attorney Pierce. The witnesses and statements at the second trial were very much the same as at the first, and on the 2nd of August, the jury retired to consider the verdict. They returned to find Mr. George Taylor and his brother Mr. William Taylor guilty of first-degree murder, and the judge sentenced them both to death by hanging. Of course, the brothers appealed the verdict, but to no avail. The date for the hanging was set for the 30th of April 1896. While they waited their fates, they were sent to the Carrollton jail. However, on the 11th of April, they escaped. William was soon apprehended and taken to jail in Kansas, but as the execution date loomed, his brother George had still not been found. In the morning of Thursday the 30th of April 1896, William Taylor went to the gallows. Before he did, he wrote a statement declaring his innocence. It read, "To the public, I have only this additional statement to make. I ought not to suffer as I am compelled to do. Prejudice and perjury convicted me. By this conviction, my wife is left a lonely widow. My babies are made orphans in this cruel world. My brothers mourn and friends weep. You hasten my grey-haired mother and father to the grave. The mobs and that element have haunted me to the grave. I had hoped to live, at least, till the good people realise the injustice done me, but it cannot be so. I feel prepared to meet my gods, and now wing my way to the great unknown, where I believe everyone is properly judged. I hope my friends will meet me all in heaven. I believe I am going there. Goodbye all." William's brother, George Taylor, was never found. Nellie Meeks was brought up by her maternal grandmother. She married a gentleman named Mr. Albert Spray, and on the 24th of February 1905, gave birth to a daughter in the town of Fulton, Missouri, who she named Harriet. Tragically, Nellie died due to complications with the birth. Harriet lived until 1977. She died in Detroit, aged 72. There have been many stories over the years regarding the tragic case of the Meeks family. When Nellie emerged, alive from the straw stack, in the early hours of the 11th of May 1894, there were two houses within view. Although they are in opposite directions, they are equal distance from the straw stack. One was the house of Mrs. Carter, while the other was the house of Mr. George Taylor. It is said that Nellie spoke of how she was told which direction to head in by the voice of her dead mother, Mrs. Delora Meeks. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.